Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. Violence, impunity, political repression, economic pressures, censorship, and threats to digital freedom make Latin America an exceptionally challenging environment for journalism. Despite these obstacles, many brave journalists continue to risk their lives and livelihoods to shine a light on important issues and hold power to account. We asked our journalist fellows, based on your knowledge of journalism in Latin America, which of these challenges do you think journalists in the region struggle with the most? 50% said threat of violence due to organized crime, 0% said online and real-life abuse from politicians, 7% said a lack of secure pay and resources, and 33% said exhaustion from dealing with all of the above. Joining us today to discuss challenges and solutions for journalists in LATAM is Elda Cantú, an editor for the New York Times based in Mexico City and author of El Times newsletter, a Spanish translation of the broadsheet's top stories. Elda is joined by Azam Ahmed, a former Mexico bureau chief whose investigative work on corruption has helped launch federal investigations, including a series covering Latin America's homicide crisis. Azam recently published Fear is Just a Word, which chronicles a mother's quest to find her daughter who was kidnapped by the Zeta drug cartel. That's The Briefing. Let's begin. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for, I think, a very important global journalism seminar talking about the state of press freedom and the press in Latin America. We have had 140 reporters killed in Mexico since 2003. And sort of open season from politicians in many countries on journalists, with colleagues in Cuba and Nicaragua forced into exile to continue doing their work. So I'm really very pleased to have with us today Elda Cantú and Azam Ahmed, both of the New York Times. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for your time today. Particularly you, Elda, who's up at 7 a.m. in Mexico City. Is that right?
It's 7:02 in Mexico City, and we're ready to go. So thank you for having us.
Brilliant. And Azam, where are you joining us from?
I'm in Lisbon.
In Lisbon, Lisboa. Thank you both. I think you both have a really unique perspective to bring to journalism in Latin America. We heard in that opening sequence the pressing challenges that we polled journalists on. But what are your personal observations of some of the challenges facing journalists in the region at the moment? Let's go to you first, Elda.
Okay, so I'll go first. Well, I think that there's, as you very well said before, we have situations of enormous violence that journalists face, but real citizens face also day to day as violence has spread throughout the region. And I think that something that's really concerning is the precarization of the industry. It's real and it's affecting local journalists more and more, particularly outside of capital cities. It's dangerous. It's, and the hardships to report and deliver important news for local outlets is really, really important. Last year, we ran, the Times Magazine ran a story about a small newsroom in Zitácuaro, Michoacán, called Monitor Michoacán by Nick Casey. And it was a chronicle of how a small newsroom got threats, struggled to, face those threats, and then had to shut down. And so I think that it sums up that that sort of circle of threats and their consequences. But I think that the larger challenge, I would say, is there's a lack of resources everywhere. And so deciding what stories to cover and how to best cover is really the main challenge, so that we can cover stories in a way that's meaningful for people. There's also a lot of fatigue on the side of readers. And so how do you tell a story that, how do you tell the story of violence, or how do you tell the story of political repression in a way that's meaningful to readers and enlightening to their lives also? So, and holding people power to account is still the job to do. And I think that, and I'm going to segue to Azam here. I think he faced a part of that challenge when he was writing his book. How after there's so many thousands of mothers who are looking for their sons in Mexico. How, why do you choose this particular story, and how do you tell the story in a way that even those people who feel that they have heard everything about the horrors are engaged and touched by that story?
Mm.
I mean, Elda's answer was great. I'll try and add what I can. I think one of the, from my time as bureau chief and then subsequent working on the book, I think one of the biggest challenges is the marketplace for journalism in the region. I mean, there's no shortage of good journalists and there's no shortage of stories. I think there is a shortage of financing mechanisms, so that one of two ways wind up being how journalists are paid for, either state funding, which is deeply compromised, especially in countries that are not exactly known for supporting a free press, or two is nonprofits, which are fickle and have their own problematic funding mechanisms. And so without a business model, a functioning business model, without a populace that understands there's a value proposition to understanding, and in the best sense of the word, or in the sense of this phrase, a nation having a conversation with itself, which is what a good media should be, it seems pretty difficult to find silver linings right now. So much of the best journalism that we see in the region is funded by nonprofit entities, not by readers who want to see what they have, or advertisers who feel like there's enough eyeballs on those stories to be worth spending X amount of dollars, which could fund the newspaper. And so that is, I think, where it begins. But then the echoes out of that are these governments don't want news institutions that can be fully independent and can call them to account. News institutions are also still struggling, including the New York Times, to find ways to engage readers when, as Elda said, there's so much fatigue. It's war, it's death, it's famine, it's corruption, it's Donald Trump. There's all these things that feel like seismic events, and there is no respite from it. And how do we present things to readers, or offer readers, deliver them enough content that can truly engage them and make them want to pay? And I think we're all sort of on that continuum, but Latin America feels like it's less far along.
It sounds like there are three themes emerging, and I want to deal with all of them, but it seems symptomatic of democracy in trouble when governments no longer want to make it viable for media to be profitable. B, that genuinely the business model is struggling, and nobody seems to have cracked this nut, and maybe we can discuss that more. But C, the impact on journalists themselves of trying to operate in that environment, and add to that organized crime. That's a lot to remain resilient under those conditions. Azam, I wanted to ask you, this might be an unfair apple and oranges question, but as you have reported from Afghanistan in the past and across South America, how does it come? Where did you feel less safe while reporting?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I'm not going to dodge it. I'm just trying to think of what way to answer it that's satisfying. I think in Afghanistan, you knew there was a front line. It was a declared war. It was a U.S. sort of occupation of a country. And so there was a framework to process and think about. And so, there was general risk, but it was very much an ideological battle, and the lines were quite cleanly identified. I think in Latin America, it's a shifting sort of thing, like the government might be the one coming after you, or organized crime, or some other group that you're not aware of. You're not exactly sure when you've entered into inhospitable or dangerous territory and how far you can go into it. I think living in Latin America, I probably had more sleepless nights than I did in Afghanistan. I think in Afghanistan, you're part of this war machine in some ways, and you're covering it and you're writing critically about it. But the the pushback mechanisms are PAOs, and people who are going to complain or write a letter to the editor. The pushback mechanisms in Latin America are a bit darker in some way.
Mm,
You don't know when you've crossed these sort of invisible lines and offended someone. And I should also say, and this is probably the most important thing I'll say today, there's a huge difference being an American correspondent from the New York Times working in this region. I'm a brown man, person of color, and yet I walk with a lot of privilege because of my US passport and because I have the imprimatur of the New York Times behind me.
mm,
Organized crime, governments have to think twice before they push back or, do something more than just push back. Whereas a lot of our colleagues and the people whom I respect, whose work, is often integral to me understanding what's going on in these countries, they don't have that luxury. And
mm,
so comparing Afghanistan to Mexico is still comparing a privileged place in a privileged position in a difficult place to a privileged position in a difficult place. I would
mm,
argue that neither of those bear any sort of real relevance for our colleagues in Latin America, working at local papers, working in these regions, who don't have a protection mechanism. Or if they do, it's like the Mexican government's protection mechanism, which is, pardon my French, bullshit. It doesn't save anybody's, it doesn't do the kinds of things that it is meant to do. It's sort of, peak Mexico. It's an excellently written law that is almost not at all executed.
mm. I really appreciate that answer, Azam. Thank you for being so thoughtful. When we talk about the kind of unique dangers and lines that you need to tread, I think it's fair to say there's something in every country, whether it's LATAM, Africa, Afghanistan. Everywhere has its challenges, but for both of you, maybe we can start with you, Elder, and then Azam. Uh, have you learned any lessons in regard to um, being safe, learning quickly, upholding different norms?
I think that after Asam's answer, it's a tough intervention to follow, but
Yeah.
I think that approaching every subject with humility and care is really important. I think that listening carefully to the sources and being aware of the environment are also things that I have learned. Most of my work happens in the safety of a desk. I I work with colleagues who are on the ground and in the field, and I talk to them and I worry about them. But I think that wherever you are, it's just being really aware of your surroundings and approaching every situation with an enhanced presence of mind and thinking not only about what do you want to do, for your story, but thinking about the people that you're covering and the risks involved for them when they talk to you, and just having that always, the big picture. You're thinking about your story, you're thinking about what do you want to tell readers. You're trying to do your best work to make readers aware of a particular situation, but you also have to think about the repercussions that every action that you take has on the field. And I think that one thing in general, and only because you were talking earlier about this sort of like toll on mental health, I think social media, just standing away, a little bit from social media also helps for safety reasons, but also for mental health reasons. It's just something that you you don't want to be a big part of your day in the way you shape your decisions.
Yeah. Do you want to add it to that, Azam?
Sure. I think on the physical security aspect, it comes in layers, right? There is the kind of overarching layer, which is understanding what's happening, talking to as many people as you can about the dynamics on the ground. If it's a war, who's in charge, where the front line is, who has the advantage, what's been happening recently, to orient yourself to the nature of the conflict, the two warring sides, and where you're going to try and fit into it. The next one is understanding that framework and the story that you're working on. So where do you need to go? How long do you need to be there? To what extent do you need to be on the ground for a sustained amount of time versus an in and out kind of thing? And who you're going to work with is important.
Mm.
And then I think that third layer is exactly what Elda was talking about. It's situational awareness. It's being switched on. It's having everything else in mind, but watching what the street looks like, watching what the dynamic feels like. There's been times when I planned on being somewhere for hours, got a sense of something, like you call it like a glitch in the matrix, and you're like, okay, we're leaving. Like you just know. And that comes with time, but it's also, trust your instincts and trust in your gut. Uh, and in particular, there are so many layers in the Latin American context that it's essential to really try and do as much of your homework as possible, to talk to people. And, the best people to talk to often are local journalists. Sometimes they're not going to want to help that much. I've had that experience too, but you should reach out and try because they're going to know a lot more than you will coming in cold. And it's not just when you're some international correspondent, it could be someone from the region or someone even from the country going into, it could be a journalist from Mexico City going into Tamaulipas. They'd be wise to call someone like Elda and ask, hey, what's going on there? How does this work? Who's good to work with? So I think on the physical security side, that to me is quite important. It's just like establishing that layer and understanding where you are in that, but having all three of those layers. The mental health, it's really hard. I mean, stepping away from Twitter and social media, I think is essential. I think it's grown more toxic, less hospitable. Um, but also it remains something that people have to keep an eye on, especially if they're
Mm.
covering beats and the
Mm.
news.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, the mental health component, I don't know. I think it's also having a life outside of the journalism you're covering, finding
Yeah.
ways to balance out and enrich your work.
Yeah, I think that is very key. I want to lean into that actually, into the well-being aspect, before we come back to the kind of practical and business side. You're both working, as you've already said, as I'm alluding to the privilege of working for one of the most profitable news outlets, maybe the most profitable news outlet in the world. What support and services do you get from the Grey Lady that you wish were available to other journalists in the region?
I would say that the most important resource, and I think that, and the reason why I want to highlight this, because I
Mm.
think this is something that is possible, it's available to everyone, is just having a manager, an editor, a boss who understands the pressures that you're going through, who can anticipate when you're going to be tired, and
Mm.
who can tell you in no uncertain terms that it's time to stop. I think that's and then having your back on your reporting and supporting the your story and standing by your story is really really important. And I think we can have fancy coffee makers and we can have days off, and that also makes it for a nice thing. But just having the person who manages your time and your work being aware of your energy and your level of stress, and just having you having someone else who can say it's like it's enough, you need to
Mm.
stop.
Mm.
Whether it's go out and go out for a walk, and we'll pick this up in a little bit, or just having someone on the other side who can really support you in that way, I think is really important.
Yeah, give permission to look after your well-being. Sometimes we need it. Azam, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Outside of the mental health stuff, I think it's nice to know that there are going to be resources for you to dig as deep as you need to dig or to
Mm.
find out what you need to find out. If you need
Mm.
to take a flight somewhere to do some reporting, you can. Um, if you have an ambitious idea, you have a plan to execute it. I mean, they're not just going to sign off on anything, but if you have a plan to execute it and there's a high likelihood of probability, there is an allowance for that. Um, when it comes to the journalism and the institution itself has infrastructure that is tremendously helpful. There's a security team you can call and check in with who will give you a general lay of the land, sort of just an overwatch layer that gives you a bit of comfort as you go into the field.
Mm.
Um, you often are paired with a photographer if it's a longer term assignment. And that's good because you have a reporting buddy, someone you can be with and talk through the story with, but also who can give you a second opinion on security issues. So I would say the resources themselves, those assets they can deploy when they want something covered, and the way in which you don't feel like you're having to count your pennies necessarily is a relief, because if you're already in a stressful and difficult situation, to then have the financial component of that weighing on you, and it weighs on you, of course, but like weighing on you tremendously, such that it curtails the quality of the reporting, that's tough. And I feel like we get alleviated of that by the Times.
Yeah, so let's talk about the lack of secure pay and resources, because a lot of that circles around, some of the revolution that's happened in terms of digital media. On the one hand, it's really crippled legacy outlets. On the other hand, it has made a lot of independent journalism possible, but it doesn't feel like there's been a transition to sustainability. So I'm going to essentially, I'm going to throw out a very broad question, and let's just see how you both feel about this. Um, is LATAM's independent journalism overly reliant on external funding and grants?
Let's go for the bottom line. The bottom line is that a healthy society needs a healthy media landscape. And many outlets have been able to survive because, and some of them actually to be born because there's funding, and there has been funding in moments and places where it would have otherwise disappeared. And I think that's a positive thing. I think that we have learned of many important scoops and investigations because of independent media that's doing very hard work throughout the region. And then I think that the bigger question, and the one that everybody's trying to answer, and it has to do with what you were saying before, Caitlin, it has to do with the business model, and how do we create a landscape where people feel that it's worth paying for the news, right? And I think everybody struggles with that.
Well, do you think, Elda, that for any reason LATAM audiences are less willing or able to pay for news? Is a readership model just unrealistic?
I'm not completely sure about that. I know that I know that Latin America is a big market for Netflix. People are paying for Netflix, and people are paying for Spotify, and so there are dollars for content out there in Latin America, and the growth of cell phones has grown a lot in the last few years. And so I don't think that's the question. I just think it has more to do with the business model, which unfortunately I'm not well versed on. But I think that just finding the audiences where they are is important, and thinking about them differently is also important. Who are you reporting for, and what do the people that you're reporting for care about?
Yeah, what do they need? I mean, apparently they need films and music, but what do they need journalistically? Azam, do you want to add anything to that?
I think she summed that up pretty well.
Yeah, I really like the Netflix and Spotify example there. Elda, staying with you, when you're producing El Times, how do you navigate the cultural and linguistic differences throughout the region when you're pulling that together?
So I think that the big challenge for El Times is we have the news report that comes out every day in the New York Times, and our job is to find what makes more sense for a Spanish speaking audience. And there's no one Spanish speaking audience, there's many different ones, You have people who speak Spanish in the United States. They might be interested in some stories. You have people who live in Latin America and who speak Spanish and in different ways with different inflections. And we also want to be mindful and respectful of those cultural differences. And we want to make sure that whatever, which is, if this morning we have a story about violence in Ecuador, and we want that story that we're going to offer in Spanish to be also, to say something that feels relevant to people who live in Guayaquil, for instance, and so we work very hard with reporters to talk through, how did people speak, and can we, if you interview people in Spanish, can we get those quotes back? And so, and that's some part of the work, but I think that, thinking of different audiences is one thing, meeting them in their own language is another thing, but also working with reporters in helping us unpack the journalism for our Spanish speaking audiences. And, sometimes we'll sit down with someone like Azam and say, can you tell me a little bit about how you did your reporting? And can you walk us through? And just, translating also our brand of journalism for a different audience. I think it's something that really people appreciate.
I'm going to go to questions from the fellows and from the audience because I think there are going to be a lot of questions today. But before I do, a question for both of you. Do you think there's a scope for some kind of collaborative effort amongst both international and local journalists across LATAM to support each other towards well-being?
I mean, like mental well-being.
Well, yeah. I mean, everything that goes into well-being, including maybe sharing business information, supporting each other emotionally. Is there, I don't know, could you see potential for some kind of collaborative intervention?
That's hard. I feel like it's a more corporate question than I'm kind of capable of answering.
Let me rephrase it. Do you think journalists in Latin America would be willing to work with each other to support each other?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I would hope so. I guess it depends on what we're talking about, right? I mean, journalists and the business model is ultra competitive. And so
Yeah.
there's a line which I think no journalist will cross, which is, giving up their scoops or their stories or their sources.
Yeah.
On the well-being security side, yeah, I think they have and they should, and whatever way you want to frame it, definitely, because it's important. Um, on the business model side, it's a bit hard because I don't really understand, as Elda was saying, what goes into the calculation of how many subscribers do we need? What do we need to provide to make this a viable going concern? And I think because no one internationally has managed to hack it yet, I mean, El País arguably, but I don't know what their finances look like. I'm curious, I am genuinely curious what that openness would be, because on the one hand, there's a nonprofit model that offers that, but then you're securing your funding is predicated on fundraising. And on the other hand, there's a capitalist model, in which case your business acumen is your IP and you're not necessarily going to share it. So I think on an individual level, absolutely there is a way to kind of create like I don't know, a group of people invested in each other's well-being. Corporate level, I have my doubts, I guess.
Well, proposal. What if the big internationals who are, if they are experiencing profitability, reinvesting some of that into creating some kind of forum where not only could local journalists come to you with questions about resilience, but you could potentially go to them with questions too. Just putting it out there. I'm going to go to a question from.
I think
Sorry, go for it.
No, no, I'm just gonna say that just you hosting this kind of spaces for reflection and networking are really useful.
Thank you. I've got a question from Raul Zepeda Gill. Forgive me if I haven't pronounced that correctly. Raul has heard in conversation with foreign correspondents that often they have stories that they want to run, but their editors are not particularly keen or don't see the value in the stories that they are pitching. What are your thoughts on? I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this without causing ramifications for anyone. Would you say that that is something that happens to foreign correspondents? And have you learned anything about how to bring your editors along on the important stories?
As someone who's on the other side many times, I would say that understanding what the work of your editor is really important. Editors have just, a reporter is pitching stories, but an editor is pitching stories higher up, for the front page. They want your story. If they take your story, they want your story to succeed. They want it to be read by many people. It's not sufficient that you care deeply about it and that you think that this is something that's worth reporting on and covering. And I think that a lot of times there's a mismatch of wills and interests. And so if you understand what the pressures and the nature of the work that your editor does and faces, then you have a better chance of, there's a pressure to produce a daily story. And then you might have a longer term project that you want to work with. But if you're only pitching a long term project that's going to take you, a lot of time and resources, you're not helping your editor do his or her work. So I think that it goes both ways, and I think that the relationships that I have seen thrive the best, like between reporters and editors or correspondents and editors are those in which they understand, that this is what you want to do and this is what we have to do, and let's find a way to make it all happen together. And I think that that's something that even freelance journalists can they sit down and understand, what this publication does and how they do it, and then they can fine tune their pitches and proposals and be a little bit more effective in that respect.
Azam, do you want to come at it from the other direction?
I think that's a great answer. I mean, that's such a good answer. I hope everybody heard that and takes notes because it's super important. I mean, I have in the past neglected that advice, and you realize, you're not pushing on an open door when you do that. From my perspective, I think there is a lot of news and a lot of huge cataclysmic things happening in the world right now. And I think when they look at what is of interest to the broadest audiences, that's where they gravitate. And for me, when I did have success in bringing Latin America to the front page or getting to do long-term investigations or 5,000-6,000 word stories, it was finding a way to situate a story in the biggest way possible. Because even on the daily, sometimes the New York Times isn't going to be able to cover a daily about something that is of great consequence to a country, but very domestically. There's just too much news, and they are trying to be a global newspaper, which means, if they're going to have 200 stories, maybe that's just not going to be one of the top 200 stories. And so our job then becomes, how do you take that idea and turn it into something bigger, so where you can step back and fold it into a series of things that have been happening recently, or find a character who personifies it, or forget about the news entirely and find something that, in your understanding of the place, having spent years there or talked to thousands of people, is important, that the world should know about. And then how do you frame and write that? That's hard, and it takes time. And no editor wants to hear like, "Hey, I've got a great year-long project. I'll see you in November. That's like, that gives them a heart attack.
Mm,
So it takes a while to get there, but I think, Raul's question is a relevant one. And it's one that I think people working in Latin America have struggled with as well. Like, how do we command the attention that we think this region deserves in a
mm,
very, very busy world where there's a war in Europe, there's a war in the Middle East,
mm,
there's a presidential election coming up in the United States. There are so many different things happening that are consequential. And, I think part of it is picking your punches carefully and
yeah,
finding a way to say many things with one story as opposed to many stories about one thing.
yeah. Well, I think you've both partially answered the question from Zishan about why we don't have a dedicated session for Pakistan's election, because it feels like every second country has an election this year, and that is why we are choosing to be very focused in the way that we approach the series this term and next term, and how we can answer as many journalist questions as possible as we go through this. So please do take these lessons that don't only apply to Latin America, they apply to a lot of countries, especially in the global south. I want to go downstairs to Francisca from Chile. Fran, hola, take it away. We can't hear you. I'm wondering, it
No?
does. There you go. Hello, go for it.
Hi, Azam. Hola, Elda. I have two questions. Sorry for that. One is about if you can tell us a bit more about the experience of the New York Times writing for Latin American audiences in Spanish. You had a project that failed a few years ago because it wasn't profitable. So the question is if you think that the project of El Times can grow it a bit more. From the Latin American perspective, it's very important that big international newspaper cover the region. It's also a shield for local journalists if the international newspapers are covering the same topics. And the other question regarding local
All right.
the work
Your connection
despite the
was
risks.
your connection was breaking up a bit there, but carry on.
The question is if you think that the threat of organized crime in local journalism in Mexico is damaging journalism. I mean, the risk is real, and I have the feeling that in the small towns that are controlled by narco-organized crimes, the fear can be too big to do the job as the public deserve.
Thanks, Fran.
I'll tackle the first one, and thank you, Fran. So I think that as you very well said, in the last 4 years, we have changed our strategy regarding our Spanish initiative, and the strategy that we have pursued in the last 3 or 4 years has been to amplify the journalism that the New York Times is already doing for Spanish-speaking audiences, and that has been it's a different challenge because the setup that we had before included producing journalism especially for Spanish-speaking audiences, and right now our audience is a little bit different, but our setup is also different. We're more integrated with the newsroom. We work more closely with coverage, not only on the foreign desk for Latin America, but we also have very productive collaborations with the science desk. The pandemic helped us strengthen our ties with health and science, and just think together about what do people in Spanish-speaking communities need to know, about vaccinations, about misinformation regarding health issues. And so we have created a different way of working that we didn't have before, that has made us a little bit more, transversal in the way we approach audiences. would I like the Times, to grow its strategy in Spanish? I would say absolutely yes. It's not for me to decide, but I think that the work that we do every day proves that there's hunger and appetite for our work in Spanish, and we see an enormous potential there. And I think the second one is more geared for Azam, regarding local journalists and threats.
I mean, you can answer every single one of these questions. Yeah, I mean, the threat is, to answer your question very quickly and bluntly, it's absolutely real. I think at the New York Times, we live in fear of getting things wrong, like having a correction run, misassessing a situation, having false analysis, or making actual mistakes. And, there's like a social castigation at the paper, right? You get a correction, you're told, don't mess it up. For them, it's often like a life or death thing. And it's not about the truth or getting something wrong. They're an arbitrary set of rules that are determined by an arbitrary set of men who wield their influence in arbitrary ways. It's so completely mystifying, even for people who are following it and tracking it all the time. So yeah, I think it's extremely real. And I think it's extremely difficult when you have places where there is no functional rule of law and no real method to protect people. What are you to do? You don't have the money to leave. You're already in a relatively underpaid job. Your news institution doesn't have the resources to support you because they're under as much fire as you are. And there is not a government, certainly at the municipal level, state level, and really at the federal level, who can do anything to protect you. You're kind of at the mercy of these armed groups. And so I'm not sure how you conduct journalism at all as it pertains to them, because their interests are varied and unpredictable. Yeah.
And I think, and I would just like to add to that, because as Azam was talking, his book is about San Fernando, and you recently had also Marcela Turati, who also wrote a recent book about San Fernando, and both of them, we have known in Mexico about, and in Latin America and even the world, about the atrocities that happened in San Fernando, in Tamaulipas in the last maybe 10 years or so. But it was sort of like a zone of silence. And there were very few things that we knew about the whole picture. And these two books coming out, roughly on the same season, just are testament to the difficulty of getting out the news locally, when organized crime steps in. And, it took an enormous amount of courage and work from Marcela and Azam to just keep working on this very particular and dangerous place, to tell the story that the people who live there can't tell on their own terms, and that there's no local institution that has told it. That there are obviously journalists on the ground working, but just like in a way that is more comprehensive, and that can do it with that certain distance also.
There are two questions downstairs, actually, that continue this theme. So we're going to come back to it. But just before we do, a question from Paulina Streta from the JX Fund, which supports exiled media. Do you know of journalists or outlets that have been forced into exile from LATAM countries, and where did they go? And is there an appetite for cross-border collaboration between international media and local media? Maybe we can start with the exile. I know of Confidencial and Nicaragua.
I think that outlets in Central America in general have been forced to move outside of their countries. I think we would be remiss in airing them in public and saying where they are.
Yeah,
just because of public safety concerns. But I would hope that someone who's trying to fund and help these outlets would have their contacts, and I'm pretty sure that if someone's listening from those outlets, they can reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do reach out, Paulina, and outlets listening, and we can connect the dots. And then cross-border collaboration. Do you think there's an appetite for sort of not really cross-border collaboration, but cross-title collaboration with local and international? Has that been done?
It's been done in some cases. It's kind of on a case-by-case, story-by-story basis. I think one of the things is that when it's been done, at the Times at least, it can be really time and resource consuming. And sometimes there's not always an alignment of vision between the publications, and it's one thing to deal with things in-house where there's like a command and control structure and people can kind of come to a conclusion and that's the conclusion. But when you have to do that in two different spaces, it can be quite hard. So there has been cross-border collaboration, cross institutional collaboration. It's challenging. It's challenging, and I think it depends a lot on the personalities involved too.
Yeah. Let's go to Noe and Omar downstairs. Noe, take it away. You're still on mute, and now you're unmuted.
Okay. Hello, Elda and Azam. Nice to meet you, and thank you for sharing this time with us. I'm from Argentina, and I am following with much interest in everything you're saying because my project here in the fellowship has to do with how to protect, how to ensure the safety of Argentinian journalists that investigate organized crime. This is becoming an issue in Argentina. It wasn't until 10 years ago. So we are dealing with that now. My question is about digital security. I have this feeling from what I've talked with dozens of colleagues in Latin America that we are not really aware about how vulnerable our data can be, about how to be safety with our digital information. But it's also true that in general, journalists in Latin America, and especially those who are freelancers, don't have the money to afford a sophisticated system. So what advices could you give to us in order to protect our data and be safer in the digital world if we don't have a lot of hundreds of dollars to spend? Thank you.
Do either of you have answers? I have answers. I'm going to share them in the chat. Two projects that deal with this question by our former fellows. But Elda and Azam, do you want to add anything that you've learned about digital safety that might be able to be replicated by local journalists?
You go ahead.
I would say that being mindful of we do so many things mindlessly on our phones and our computers, and we sometimes forget that what our assets are. If you're constantly out there and you obviously have a digital presence and a digital footprint, and sometimes it's hard to separate your personal life from your work life, but at some point both of them are the same thing when you're trying to be safe. You can't say this is like my account to be fun and this is my post to be. So I think that approaching things very with mindfulness, understanding how your data is stored, even if you don't have a lot of money and resources, just understanding where it is, where it's kept, turning off your devices at the right moment, bringing them when you have to, keeping them safe when you don't have to. I think that there are some, I would say, digital hygiene habits that are really, really important and that don't cost a lot of money. And I'm sorry that Argentina has had to learn about the dangers for journalists about organized crime. I know that colleagues in Ecuador are going through that right now. And there's certainly a lot of things that we have learned in Mexico that would be useful for colleagues elsewhere.
This is actually the project that Noe is working on at the Institute, seeing what lessons can be taken from Mexico for journalists in Argentina. So I might connect you two later to have a conversation. Umar Zombre from Burkina Faso, I think this is a beautiful question for Azam.
Thank you very much. I am Umar Zombre. One of my questions is to know what is the most dangerous story that you have covered in Latin America, and also what was the outcome of that story, and how did you manage to mitigate any safety challenges?
Let me just repeat that because the audio is breaking up. What has been the most dangerous or difficult stories you've produced in Latin America? What were the outcomes, and how did you manage to mitigate the safety challenges? Azam, that seems the dream Azam question.
The dream question. It's a good question. Yeah, the most difficult or dangerous story. I mean, it kind of depends. I mean, again, I guess I always have a hard time talking about risk and danger when it comes to stories because, you're kind of an interloper in these situations, going in to try and write about someone else's pain and real risk. To kind of center myself as like the object of risk feels a little unseemly. So I tend to not do that, but I understand what you're asking, and I don't mean to be evasive. So I'll give you an example. One of the stories, I think the story in Latin America that first kind of, I don't know, put me on edge a bit was when I started covering Pegasus. And I wasn't covering it as a news story because there wasn't really news about it. I began working with a few others, including both sources and victims of Pegasus, to build out a multi-part series of stories about what we perceive to be the government's illegal spying campaign on journalists, human rights activists, and human rights lawyers. And essentially, ultimately, I found that I was being targeted as well by the same software for stories that I had done in previous years that were looking into government corruption. And I think, you can be in hostile, kinetic environments and you sort of know the rules of the road and, you're protected to some degree and you're, that security awareness that Elda and I were talking about before. But when you feel like you might be being spied on, when you feel like your life might be exposed to unfriendly elements, it can be quite unsettling. You don't know whether or what you can communicate. You no longer have the sense of like, oh, my job ends after I do this. It's sort of like you're constantly being invaded by these thoughts of perhaps someone is looking into what I'm doing or finding a way to try and publicize or humiliate something about me. And the way you mitigate it, I guess, is to answer Noé's question, which is, you try and take whatever measures you can for digital security. If you're lucky, you have an institution that is helpful in trying to guide you in that process. And yeah, I mean, I got to the point where I just stopped using my phone very much for anything sensitive. Be in-person meetings, it would be I got a separate phone that was untraceable and used that for very sensitive calls if I couldn't meet someone in person. And you sort of strip away a lot of the personality from your telecommunications or digital communications. So yeah, you find ways to mitigate. And then physically, if there's physical risk, I think it's sort of what I was saying before, if there's a physically risky story, I mean, the book, for instance, you start to build sources, you start to understand the lay of the land, you start to meet people on various sides of things, on the government side, maybe even on the organized crime side. You kind of level with them and you say, look, this is what I'm doing, and this is how I'm going to do it. One way I've tried to protect myself too is once I've concluded an investigation, but before we publish, I am completely transparent with the target and the sources. I tell them what I'm planning on publishing and I give them ample opportunity to respond so that there's no surprises. It's not always easy. You don't want them to take what they know about what you're reporting and try and then spin it or run it back. But in the years I've been doing it, it's never happened that way. And I've always felt the relief that transparency has kind of afforded me the comfort of knowing that I'm not getting anything wrong either. Because sometimes I've had situations where when I send it, they're like, actually, that's not right. That's incorrect. And it will turn out to be incorrect. And I'm grateful for that.
It's a great answer. Thanks, Azam. Osama's question is kind of a good follow-up. Go for it. Osama from Iraqi Kurdistan.
Thank you, Azam, for your insights from Latin America. So I've read like one of your articles, and it is titled like it is normal to, or it is easy to kill journalists in Mexico. And I was kind of interested in this line from your report where you say like there are also those type of reporters crossing over to the criminal world they cover. So like there are also these journalists who like cross over to the world they were going to cover as journalists. So like I would like to hear more like, you know, how that happens, what's the breaking point, and also if that was also the case in Afghanistan.
I didn't see it as much in Afghanistan because there wasn't I mean, I guess you could argue there was a criminal world, but it wasn't as robust. It wasn't the same kind of thing that it is in Latin America. And I don't know the extent to which journalists would have moved over and worked with the Taliban or been sort of secretly working at news institutions on their behalf. But I also like to differentiate. I think one of the principal differences between Mexico, for instance, and Afghanistan is that was an ideological war. It's a war about governance. It's a war about who is going to lead the country and whose vision was going to direct the future of it, versus Latin America, where it's a business. Organized crime is meeting a demand in the United States. And it's as simple as that. They are business people who regulate their market with violence. And I think if we think about them in that way, not as ideological organizations, it's a little bit easier to understand. The journalists that I've met who acknowledge to me that they, you know, carry messages or do stories or allow their stories to be reviewed and approved by organized crime, oftentimes it's as simple as money. They don't get paid a lot as journalists, and it's not an easy profession or way to eke out a living. And so organized crime offers them a supplement to their meager income, and as a result, they allow themselves to either be manipulated or be overseen by organized crime. I think it's almost exclusively an economic thing. It's not ideological. In some ways, if it is ideological, it's the absolute lack of ideology. I don't think that many people see the government in Mexico as some noble enterprise fighting for the good of the people necessarily. And so if, you know, it's not like you're fighting on behalf of the government, but if you're going to get paid, you don't care necessarily if you're getting paid by organized crime. And then other people I've run across, they wind up sort of trapped in between two flows of information, one from the government and one from organized crime. And sometimes those streams get stuck in sort of a cross-current situation, and you tell one side something you shouldn't, and the other side something you shouldn't, and it winds up dangerous for you. But I feel, no, people who cross that line are probably almost as likely to get killed by the local government as they are organized crime. I mean, government has been known to attack and assassinate journalists.
We are rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to ask a very quick yes/no question from George Chisa. Are journalists in LATAM being served with strategic litigation against public prosecution, commonly known as SLAP suits? We're seeing a lot of that in Europe. Has that made its way over to LATAM, using lawsuits to prevent journalistic coverage? Elda, it looks like you're saying yes.
I think we have seen some instances. I don't think that they happen with as much frequency as in other places. I can think of an example of a book about presidential candidate and businessman in Peru who sued the author of non-fiction book about him, and not only suing the author but also the publisher, which is a big publishing house. And I think that case became emblematic of some of those lawsuits. but I wouldn't say it's as widespread as in other places. We certainly see that, and we also certainly see the manipulation of the law to prevent information from reaching public light.
Let me squeeze in one last question, if I can.
Just to answer that question.
Sure.
I don't think you need to. Look at somewhere like El Salvador. You have wide
more effective.
Someone like Bukele, and he can say and do whatever he wants to try and dissuade the media. Or Mexico. The president of Mexico can hold a press conference and deride whomever he wants about whatever they've covered. He doesn't need a lawsuit to incentivize media from doing its job. He can use the bully pulpit or humiliation, or honestly the impunity a lot of governments enjoy in the region to dissuade people or journalists.
Or a bullet, worst case scenario. Very, very quickly, I know we're at time, but do you have any thoughts on how to maintain resilience as a journalist in LATAM?
You want to go first? I can go first. I mean, I'm just, the sun has come out.
You're getting blasted by the sun right now. I'll jump in while you figure
very
out
jealous.
How to block how to save your eyes. Resilience. It's a hard question. I wish I knew or had a better answer. I've sometimes likened the work we do to sort of a theatrical performance where you have all this energy and it's charged and you're bringing on board new information and you're racing to this curtain close. And for me, all of that builds up in you is only released after the final bow, i.e. publication. And for me, publication has kind of been the way that I have exercised some of those anxieties or the mental, stress, I guess, of reporting. But it's not enough, clearly, right? Publishing is what we do. But I do think that is one of the things that we are allowed to do. We have agency with the things, the horrors we witness, the traumas that we take down, the suffering that we chronicle, and the wrongdoing that we try and expose. We have a means to exercise that sort of difficult energy we take on board, and that's to bring grace and the word to it. So I don't know, publishing has kind of always been my answer.
Publishing and grace. I like it.
I would say that, and I was speaking to a colleague recently about something similar to this effect. I think that a lot of people who are incredible at their work see sometimes journalism as a gift or a calling or a cause. And all of those things are very, noble and good, but they don't help when you're trying to be resilient and keep your sanity. And so understanding that it is a job and a profession and it has hours and that you need compensation for it and that you have to shut down your computer or turn off your phone and just like go hang out with people who are not journalists and spend time with your family and not be talking about work. And so just, thinking about it as work, it helps because work starts and ends, and it gives you compensation but it's not everything that you are. We like to think that, we are journalists and we are journalists, but we also have to think about ourselves in different ways and dimensions. And I think that in my case, that helps, you're doing your work to the best of your ability and you're delivering that and you're doing it with professionalism and certain standards and sense of pride. But there's also other parts of you who are not, journalism. And it's good to cultivate them.
Thank you both so much for your time and some extra 5 minutes. I will say, at the risk of making a South American etiquette mistake without any political implication, la lucha continua. And we will see you guys, and we wish you continued success in all of your efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Everybody.
Go well.